Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on the upcoming Israeli elections. My name is Shai Tamari. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. It is my great pleasure to have Amir Tibon from Haaretz with us today. As many of you know, Israel will have its fourth elections next week. And ironically, I had Amir come to UNC twice before each previous election that we've had in Israel. And so I thought it would only be appropriate to have him again to discuss what's going on and to provide us some more guidance and answer some questions, as well as kind of discuss how these elections may impact U.S.-Israeli relations. So just briefly about Amir, I actually first met Amir about 2 or 3 years ago. Amir was the Haaretz correspondent in DC between 2017 and 2020, and recently returned back to Israel and had a baby girl. And so Mazel Tov. And before that, Amir was with Walla News and has received numerous awards for his writing. He also wrote a book about Mahmoud Abbas, the current Palestinian president. And currently, Amir is the US editor for Haaretz. He is living in Nachal Oz, Kibbutz Nachal Oz, which is in the southern part of Israel, near the Gaza Strip. And what we're going to do today is that Amir is going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then this will be followed up with Q&A. You will not be able to unmute yourself. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat box. I'll moderate the discussion afterwards and read out your questions and have Amir answer them. We'll go for about 60 minutes in total. I've noticed that usually people get tired after 60 minutes of a virtual event. If we want to go a bit longer, we might do so, but 60 minutes is our aim. Before Amir starts, I just want to thank our co-sponsors or sponsors. So this event is sponsored by my center, the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, which is part of the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. And we have partners with the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies on campus as well. This is also co-sponsored by the Curriculum in Global Studies, the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense, the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, the Department of Public Policy, the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at UNC, and the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to let Amir discuss his thoughts, and we'll come back for Q&A later on. As he's talking, please feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat, and I'll go straight into the Q&A once it's done. Thank you very much. And Amir, the stage is yours.
Okay. Good, very early afternoon to everyone, early evening here in Israel. Shai, thank you for the very nice introduction. And it's great to see you again, my friend. It's become a habit now. There's an election in Israel and we meet the 2 previous times. Yes, I came over to visit you. Now we do it by Zoom. Maybe by the 5th or 6th election, we meet again. I don't know. I hope we don't get there. But this has been a period, just like Shai said, of unprecedented instability in Israel. We have never had a scenario before of 2 elections in the same year. That did not happen until the year 2019. And here we are in 2021 entering the 4th election. And the joke I just made about a 5th election, it was dark humor because it's more than just a joke. It could realistically actually happen. How did we get here? How did Israel get to this situation? And what is this election, the 4th one in a period of just over 40 months, really about? Those are the 2 issues I will speak about today. Perhaps some of the people who are joining today to listen were also present at my 2 previous lectures with UNC. I will try very hard not to be too repetitive, because if you already heard me speak about Israel's first or third election, you don't need to hear all the details of how the system works anymore. But if you are confused about how the election system actually works, you can submit a question about it to the chat, and I'll be happy to respond later. So I promised to touch on two questions. How did we get here, and what is this current election really about? If you're following media reports from Israel, maybe not on Haaretz, but on a lot of other outlets, there is a tendency to, in my opinion, a bit, kind of in a lazy way, to say this is an election about nothing. Or you can say, a Seinfeld election, right? Seinfeld was known to be the show about nothing, and yet it ran for 10 consecutive seasons. And so, you could have an election about nothing for 4, 5, 6 rounds. And another tendency you will see in media reports is to say this is an election that is only about yes Netanyahu or no Netanyahu, to Bibi or not to Bibi. I'm going to challenge those notions today. I think this is not an election about nothing. In fact, it is an election about everything. It's a critical election to Israel's future, and it's about much more than just Netanyahu's personal fate. But in order to explain why I do believe those two statements, I have to start by touching on how we actually got here. We had an election in Israel in April 2019 that we now call the first election. In most societies, countries, when somebody says the first election, they're probably talking about the country's first election ever. And until 2 years ago, if you spoke to an Israeli about the first election, they would assume you're referring to the election that Israel held in 1949 when the country was founded. But today, when Israelis say the first election, everybody understands that they're talking about the election of April 2019, because our country doesn't really have a history anymore earlier than 2019, or at least not one that we can remember. It's as if everything started over there in April 2019, and we've been in a deadlocked, endless cycle of elections ever since. What happened in April 2019? We had an election. And as I explained in my previous lectures with Shai and UNC, our election system is very different than the American system. In America, you vote for a president or a senator or a member of Congress. You choose a specific person for a specific job. The person that gets more votes earns that job. Of course, in America, you recently had an attempt to challenge that old notion. And you had an election where one candidate appeared to win more votes, but the other refused to accept it. But when your system normally works like it should, one person receives more votes for a specific job and they get that job. But in Israel, we don't vote for a prime minister. Nobody in Israel goes to polling stations and chooses a prime minister. We have a parliamentary system where you vote for a party. And usually in most Israeli elections, after all the votes are counted, something between 10 to 12 different parties get representation in our parliament, in the Knesset. How do you become prime minister? The leaders of those 10, 11, 12 parties that get enough seats to be represented in the Knesset, every one of them potentially, theoretically, could become prime minister. But in essence, what you need is to have the support of a majority of members of the Knesset for the role of prime minister. The Knesset overall has 120 seats. So the majority you need in order to be prime minister is 61. Why am I giving you all these numbers? In what we now call the first election, April 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, had the support of 60 members of Knesset to swear in a new government. Who are those 60 members of Knesset? It's basically his Likud party and all the different religious parties of Israel, most notably the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredi parties, we can call them as well, that represent the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population. So again, April 2019, just almost 2 years ago, Likud and all the religious parties together had 60, which is 1 seat short of a majority. All the forces in the Knesset that opposed Netanyahu in that election in April also had 60. Who are the forces that oppose Netanyahu in today's Israel? It's not just the left wing. The old divide in Israeli politics between right and left, which was focused on the issue of the Palestinian population, the settlements. That is not the main divide in our politics anymore, because the forces that oppose Netanyahu, they include some secular right-wing parties. Why secular right-wing? I'll get to it in a second, but maybe you can find a hint in the fact that I said earlier, Netanyahu's base of support is Likud and all the religious parties. So the secular forces on the Israeli right are now part of the anti-Netanyahu group of parties, all the way from them to the far left of Israeli politics. It's basically, a very, very weird, eclectic group of parties, secular right-wingers, centrists, Zionist left, and the non-Zionist left, which is mostly basically the Arab population that votes for what we call the joint list in Israel. Those forces in April 2019 also had 60. So 60 and 60 together is 120, but you need 61 to have a government. And because nobody could form a government, we had this deadlock, and for the first time in Israel's history, we went to a second election in the same year. It looked crazy back then, but now we are in election number 4, so we barely remember it. In the second election, the results were different. The group of parties that support Netanyahu, Likud and all the religious parties, had 55 seats. They dropped from 60 to 55. The group of parties that oppose Netanyahu, from the secular right wing all the way to the joint list, which is mostly, as I said, represents the Arab population, they had 65, which is much more than what you need for a stable, functioning government. But those elections, which were held in September 2019, and we now call them the second election, they exposed a very painful truth about Israeli politics, which is that the pro-Netanyahu forces, even if they are a minority, even if they are smaller, they are ideologically cohesive and have a shared agenda. The forces that oppose Netanyahu, from the secular right wing, which is against his own personal corruption. Maybe you are aware that Netanyahu is currently facing an indictment on 3 criminal charges, but also, even more importantly, in my opinion, opposes his alliance with the religious parties. So those secular right-wing forces, they're against Netanyahu, but they have very little in common with the joint list, which is a combination of a communist party, an Arab nationalist party, and they also used to have an Islamist party, but now they've broken up. I'll get to it in a few minutes. The important thing is that while the Netanyahu bloc was smaller, they only had 55, they stuck together. The anti-Netanyahu bloc, even though they won a clear majority of 65 seats, could not form a government together because the ideological differences between the secular right wing and the joint list were too wide. And so nobody could swear in a government. And we went to a third election in March 2020, exactly a year ago. That election also ended with a small majority for the anti-Netanyahu forces. But again, they were not able to turn that small majority into a government. That's why I call the anti-Netanyahu forces in Israel the non-governing majority. They are a majority, but they cannot govern. Netanyahu, who has been the incumbent prime minister during this entire time, didn't win a majority in any of the 3 elections, but he leads a governing minority because they've not been able to replace him, so he just stayed on the job. After the third election in March last year, the anti-Netanyahu coalition, well, coalition is a bad word here, but the anti-Netanyahu bloc of parties broke apart. Some leaders of those parties, like Benny Gantz, who is currently Israel's defense minister and was Netanyahu's key opponent in the 3 election rounds, decided to join a government with Netanyahu. The excuse that led them to do it was COVID. They said there is a terrible crisis going on right now, economically, health-wise. This is a threat to our very lives. We need an emergency government that will bring together forces from different parts of the political spectrum. And so Benny Gantz joined Netanyahu's government. They signed an agreement that was supposed to basically put an end to Netanyahu's time in office in November 2021, 8 months from today. When that agreement was signed, Benny Gantz was told that there was a very big loophole in the agreement. The loophole was that in Israel, if a government does not pass a state budget by a certain date, that government automatically dissolves and an election is automatically triggered. And Benny Gantz, when he was alerted of this loophole, told the people who brought it to his attention, Netanyahu is a cynical politician, but even he is not cynical enough to not pass a state budget in the midst of the worst economic crisis that we've had in decades, the COVID crisis. He was wrong. Netanyahu refused to pass a state budget. The government fell apart, and we are now heading to the fourth election, which will take place a week from today. During this entire period, there was supposedly an easy way to avoid all of these subsequent elections after the first election in April. What needed to happen is a simple thing that in maybe 10 years ago would have happened overnight. The ultra-Orthodox parties, which we are counting as part of Netanyahu's bloc, could have decided to go into a government with Benny Gantz. Historically, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, the very strictly religious Jews, had the role of the ultimate kingmakers in Israeli politics. They could go with either side, the right wing or the left wing. In the old divide in Israeli politics, right wing, left wing, mostly on the Palestinian issue, settlements, etc. The ultra-Orthodox, one time they went with Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of Likud. Then they went with Yitzhak Rabin, the leader of Labor. Then they went with Netanyahu in his first term as prime minister in the mid-1990s. Then they went with Ehud Barak from the Labor Party, who defeated Netanyahu in the election and replaced him. Then they went with Ariel Sharon from Likud, who replaced Barak. Then they went with Ehud Olmert, who was the leader of the centrist, maybe slight center-left tendency, Kadima party that basically defeated Netanyahu in 2006. And then they went again with Netanyahu when he came back in 2009 and replaced Olmert. They were always there, right wing, left wing, center, as long as they received budgets from the state for their institutions and control over some religious legislation, they were willing to go with either side. And Benny Gantz, as the leader of the center-left, anti-Netanyahu bloc, was caught on tape saying that he is very confident that if Netanyahu does not have a majority to form a government, the ultra-Orthodox will break away from Netanyahu and join a government led by him. And Benny Gantz said, I will give the ultra-Orthodox a blank paper with my signature, and they can fill whatever they want on that paper. But the ultra-Orthodox refused. They did not go with Gantz, not after the first election, which was a deadlock, not after the second election, not after the third election. They stuck with Netanyahu. And we have an election a week from today. If Netanyahu and the group of parties that support him, again, Likud and all the religious parties, will not reach a 61-seat majority, I believe the ultra-Orthodox will again stick with Netanyahu and not join a government with any of his challengers. Why is that? Why are the ultra-Orthodox giving up on their traditional role as the kingmakers of Israeli politics? Why are they not willing to go with Netanyahu's challengers like they have in the past, where whoever wins the election, they go with that side? This is where we get to the issue of what this election is all about. When Benny Gantz said that he will give the ultra-Orthodox a blank paper, they can fill whatever they want, I think he sincerely meant it. He was willing to give them the same budgets they get from Netanyahu's governments. He was willing to give them the same level of control over religious issues in Israel. It's important to understand for an American audience that in Israel, we don't have separation of religion and state. We don't have a constitution that promises the separation of religion and state like you guys have in the United States. And as a result, there is a lot of religious legislation that dictates the manner of life in Israel. You cannot get the state to recognize a wedding or a divorce unless the rabbinical ultra-Orthodox authorities approve of it. That's why thousands of Israelis, including me and my wife, after they have a wedding ceremony, fly abroad to get married legally in another country, because Israel recognizes marriages that were done in other countries, but it will not recognize a marriage that was done in Israel itself, not through the ultra-Orthodox authorities. You cannot get divorced either without going through the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate. Imagine that as an American citizen, you had to go through the Catholic or some Protestant stream of the church to get married or divorced. That's the reality we have in Israel. And a lot of secular Israelis and even some religious Israelis want to change it. But for the ultra-Orthodox, that's a big no-no. They want to keep that power. And Benny Gantz was willing to let them keep that power. But there was one thing that if they had written on Benny Gantz's blank document with the signature and handed it to him, he would have erased his signature. And that is a demand from the ultra-Orthodox parties to weaken Israel's Supreme Court. This is something that only one politician in Israel is willing to give them. And that politician is the current Prime Minister, Netanyahu. And that is the reason they are sticking with him. Let me explain. In Israel, like in the United States, we have judicial review. The Supreme Court of Israel has the authority to intervene in legislation when it sees a contradiction between a law that was passed by the Knesset and the Israeli, well, we don't have a constitution, but our version of the constitution, which is the Israeli basic laws. You guys in America have a constitution. We have basic laws. These are laws that were legislated in the Knesset and have a higher standing, a more powerful standing than regular laws. Basic laws, basically, what they do is they define the values and the guiding system of the Israeli democracy. And so, if the Knesset in Israel tomorrow morning passes a law that discriminates against gays and lesbians, discriminates against Arab citizens, discriminates against women, the Supreme Court has the ability to come and say, this law that you just passed contradicts the basic laws of the State of Israel, which are supposed to defend citizens from discrimination. And it contradicts the founding document of Israel, our Proclamation of Independence, which promises equal treatment to the citizens. Now, of course, this is complicated because discrimination can come in different shapes, ways, and colors. Sometimes it's easy for the Supreme Court to strike down a discriminatory law. Sometimes it's more complicated because the discrimination is more ambiguous. There is a debate on whether it is discriminatory or not, and some of the discrimination can actually be in line with other founding values of the state, because Israel is a Jewish state, a Zionist state. It's a very complicated issue. But the bottom line that I'm trying to bring to your attention is that over the last several decades, the Israeli Supreme Court has played a fundamental role in liberalizing Israeli society. And that has made the Supreme Court an enemy for the ultra-Orthodox leadership. A lot of the progress that we have seen in Israel in the last, I would say, 30 years, on gay rights issues, on women's rights issues, on more rights, more equality to the Arab and other minorities in Israel, on issues that are actually important for Jewish pluralism and liberalism in Israel, recognizing the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, which in America are the majority, Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism. A lot of the progress we have seen on those fronts, and actually achievements that Israel's supporters in the United States celebrate and mention when they want to defend Israel against criticism. Probably, if you've seen criticism of Israel, for example, on campus, one of the first things you will hear from Israel's supporters is, look how Tel Aviv is the most gay-friendly city in the Middle East. Look how Israel offers more women's rights than all the countries around it, etc., etc. A lot of that progress that I, as an Israeli citizen, am proud of, and that supporters of Israel abroad like to celebrate, came through interventions by the Supreme Court. It was cases where the Supreme Court said, this form of discrimination, this existing law, it needs to change because it contradicts our version, our constitutional, replacement, the basic laws. The ultra-Orthodox have had a dream of generations to weaken the Supreme Court because of how they see it as a liberalizing force in Israeli society. But historically, they never had the ability to do it because there were many things that the Labour Party and the Likud Party, the right wing and the left wing in Israel disagreed on. But one thing that was pretty broadly a consensus was that we need to protect the standing of our Supreme Court. Likud, Netanyahu's party, the biggest party in the Israeli right wing, was historically a liberal party because the historical division in Israeli politics was mostly around economic issues in the founding years of the country. Israel was founded by a socialist-leaning Labor Party, and Likud was the main liberal opposition. And Likud believed that the Supreme Court is very important as an instrument in protecting the rights of the minority in Israel. Menachem Begin, the mythological leader of Likud, had a famous quote, Yesh shoftim b'Yerushalayim, there are justices in Jerusalem. Meaning, even if there is a Supreme Court decision that you don't like, that you disagree with, you have to respect it because there are justices in Jerusalem. They are our justices. They are the most important institution for our legal system. Netanyahu himself, for many years, was proud of upholding that tradition within Likud. If we had more time today, time, of course, is always the most expensive commodity, I would show you videos of Netanyahu from 7, 8 years ago, talking about how proud he is to defend the Israeli Supreme Court and its standing. And he said, I have criticism of some Supreme Court decisions. I don't always like the direction the Supreme Court goes in, which is fine. I mean, the Supreme Court is just like any other institution, needs to be criticized. But at the end of the day, he said, we need to protect the Supreme Court. It has an important role in our democracy. But fast forward to today, 2019, 20, 21, suddenly Netanyahu has changed his tune. And he is speaking about weakening the Supreme Court, something that, again, for the ultra-Orthodox parties has been a dream of generations. The ultra-Orthodox want to weaken the Supreme Court because they see it as a liberalizing force in Israeli society, and they are afraid of some future decisions it could make. For example, in Israel, on paper, all of the Jewish population has to serve in the military. I served for 3 years, my wife served for 2 years. Both of my parents, father and mother, were officers. My younger brother is currently serving as a medical doctor in the military. And yet, the ultra-Orthodox community has an exemption from military service. And the ultra-Orthodox are today almost 15% of the country's population. And in younger age groups, they are a quarter of the population. The ultra-Orthodox leadership is terrified that at some point the Supreme Court will intervene in this issue and say, enough. It's discrimination against the Jewish secular population and against minority populations in Israel that serve in the military, that the ultra-Orthodox are completely exempt from service. This would be a very severe blow to the ultra-Orthodox way of life, because what do the young ultra-Orthodox men do instead of going to the military? They go to study in the yeshivas, which is their version of, I don't know, you can compare it to a university, to a college, but instead of getting a degree, you learn religious texts all day, and you get paid a salary from the government for doing it. So this is another issue where they are afraid that the Supreme Court at some point will intervene, and they see it as a threat to their way of life. 2 weeks ago, our Supreme Court had a landmark decision that increased the rights of the non-Orthodox Jewish streams in Israel. I'm not going to go into the entire mechanism, but it was a decision that enraged the ultra-Orthodox politicians. And so they want to weaken the Supreme Court for ideological reasons. But why has Netanyahu changed his view on this? Why is it suddenly possible for the ultra-Orthodox parties to get cooperation on this issue? That has to do with his criminal trouble. Netanyahu's most important plan, if he gets a majority in this election, and if not in this election, maybe in the 5th election, but once he secures a majority for Likud and the religious parties, he wants to immediately pass a law that would cancel his criminal indictment retroactively, because it's already being in court. It's already in front of 3 judges in the District Court of Jerusalem. He wants to retroactively cancel it. Now, Netanyahu knows very well that the Israeli Supreme Court will immediately strike down such a law as against the basic laws of the State of Israel. You cannot pass a law that shields one specific citizen from a criminal indictment after the court trial has already begun. The Supreme Court will immediately cancel it and say this is unconstitutional. And then what Netanyahu wants to do is pass a subsequent law that allows the smallest majority in the Knesset, 61 seats, to override Supreme Court decisions. And then they can cancel the Supreme Court's decision to cancel the law that would cancel his indictment. I hope you were able to follow along the logic. But basically, his personal interest, for the first time ever, meets the dream of the ultra-Orthodox to weaken the Supreme Court and to give the smallest possible majority in the Knesset the ability to overrule Supreme Court decisions. If that happens next week, if Netanyahu and the religious parties reach a majority, and then they are able to weaken the Supreme Court, Israel will change as a country. A lot of the progress that we have celebrated, that we've been proud of in Israel, could be overturned by this kind of government, because without the protections that the Supreme Court does allow to women and to the gay community and to minorities in Israel and to the Jewish pluralistic streams, without the Supreme Court, a lot of those protections and a lot of the progress that has been made could be reversed. And this is why I say this is not an election about nothing. It's actually an election about everything. It's an election about what kind of country Israel is going to be. Is it going to be a country where we still have the judicial review process and the Supreme Court that is slowly but steadily pushing the country in a more pluralistic, more democratic, more liberal direction? Or is it going to be a country that is going in the other direction, becoming more religious, becoming less open? This is the main issue that is on the line. A few more minutes about the possible scenarios of this election, and then I'll move on to the chat, to the Q&A. Basically, there are three ways this election could end. The first scenario is what I just talked about, Netanyahu and the religious parties reaching a majority. The second scenario is that if Netanyahu does not have a majority, finally, after 4 election rounds, the anti-Netanyahu forces manage to form a government and replace him. I'm not very bullish on that actually happening, because if they failed the last 2 times that they had a majority, why would it be different now? But maybe everyone is so sick of these endless election cycles, so tired of it, that compromises will be found, that everyone will give up on their ideology a little bit and unite in a very weird, very eclectic government that runs all the way from the right to the left, just in order to do 3 things. Number 1, replace Netanyahu. Number 2, get rid of the ultra-Orthodox parties, move them out of government. And number 3, bring stability to Israel, because 4 election cycles are not a healthy thing for a country in 2 years. Elections bring out division, they bring out hatred, sometimes they bring violence. You just saw that in the United States. And an election, there is a good reason why most democracies hold an election once every 4 years. You need time to heal from that. You need time to get over it. You need time to get to a situation where you can once again have a pleasant conversation with your friend, neighbor, family member who voted the opposite from you. It takes time to heal these divides. And this is what that kind of government might be potentially able to achieve. But the third scenario is that neither side, maybe neither side has a governing majority, and then we go to a 5th election in the summer. And meanwhile, Netanyahu's criminal trial would continue because he won't have the majority to cancel it. Which of the 3 scenarios will it be? I am not a prophet. I'm not going to guess. Shai, you might have to do another session like this, once we know what happened. But that's all I have to say for now, and I would love to get questions. I see a few questions in the chat. I would love to get some more. So Shai, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, Amir, thank you so much. I follow Israeli politics fairly closely, and each time I hear you speak, I learn something new. So thank you so much for that. Before I go through the questions in the chat, and please, if you have more questions, please submit them. Amir, can you talk briefly about the state of left-wing or left-leaning parties in Israel?
Sure.
Ma'arach, Meretz, and also the Arab parties.
Sure. The Israeli left is entering this election in a terrible situation. In Israel, the most important component of our electoral system is something which we call the electoral threshold. What is the electoral threshold? In order to win any representation at all in our Knesset, in our parliament, A party needs to receive 3.25% of the total votes that were cast in the election. If a party receives 3%, not 3.25%, only 3% of the total vote, which in Israel is about 150,000 votes, all of those votes go to the trash. They are not counted because they are below the electoral threshold. This gives parties in Israel an incentive to unite and run together. Because if you have 5 seats, 6 seats, 7 seats together, that's a secure a number of votes to pass the electoral threshold. But if you take 6 seats and you divide them between 2 parties and each one gets 3, what happens? Both of them fall beneath the threshold. So instead of having 6 for 2 political parties, you get 0. In this election, for reasons of extreme irresponsibility, extreme selfishness, and extreme stupidity, I guess is the word. The Israeli center left is running in 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe 6 different parties. This is an extremely dangerous situation. The right wing made this mistake in some of the previous election rounds. They had too many small parties. 1 or 2 didn't pass the threshold. Boom, Netanyahu doesn't have a majority. This time, in the forces that oppose Netanyahu, and especially on the left, you have the Labour Party, Meretz, you have Blue and White, which is the remnants of Benny Gantz's big party. Now they are polling just above or beneath the threshold. And the Joint List, which used to be this conglomeration of communists and Arab nationalists and Islamists, they also broke into 2 parties. There is the communists are still with the Arab nationalists, but the Islamists are running in their own slate. Between these 5 different parties, you need a miracle for each and every one of them to pass the electoral threshold, and there is another small economic left-wing populist party that has no chance to pass the threshold, but could take enough votes to bring down one of the other parties with it. This is a very dangerous situation for the Israeli center-left, because, like I said, if one of those parties doesn't pass the threshold next week, that increases the likelihood that Netanyahu gets a majority. If all of them pass, there is no chance in the world for Netanyahu to have a majority. There is a lot of pressure on these parties now that at least one of them will withdraw from contending in the election and then, save us this scenario. But yeah, basically, if you don't pass the electoral threshold, you don't make it into the Knesset. You can run again in the next election. You can run again next time, but in this Knesset, you will not be represented. And so the Israeli left right now is facing a very difficult situation. And I think what makes it even worse is that it was avoidable. There was a lot of pressure on the party leaders on the left to unite before the final date for submitting the lists for the Knesset, which is a technical but important date that happened. We already passed it more than a month ago. Once those parties refused to unite and save us the heartache of watching them, potentially fall beneath the threshold, there was a backlash among their own voters who said, we're so angry at their irresponsibility. We're so angry at their selfishness. We are going to vote for centrist or secular right-wing parties that oppose Netanyahu, because we're so angry at what they did. They didn't listen to us. We want to vote this time we're not going to vote for Netanyahu and his religious supporters. That's obviously not the issue, but we want to vote either for the centrist parties or the right-wing secular forces that oppose him, because we are sick of this irresponsibility and, children's games on the left. Will these people who are talking like that actually go to the polling booth next week and vote for a party that is not their traditional party, Labour or Meretz? I don't know. I mean, when you go to the voting booth, you can make a statement before, but in there you're alone and your hand is trembling. But I mean, there is a lot of anger on the leadership of the left-wing parties for how they handled this issue and for the threat that they've put themselves in.
Okay, thanks you, Amir. Let's start with the questions in the chat box. So the first question, does Israel recognize a foreign divorce without approval by the ultra-Orthodox?
Getting married abroad is easy and getting the state to recognize it, but divorce is a much more difficult issue. I think there is some level of practical recognition by state authorities, but not an official stamped recognition that this couple is divorced. And that's just one example, which I know to Americans sounds crazy. How can you let religious authorities have that level of control of your life? But this is what we are facing here. Yes.
Thank you. Are Supreme Court justices appointed or elected?
Supreme Court justices in Israel are nominated by the government and then selected, or I would rather say approved or voted down by a committee that includes representatives for the government, the opposition, the lawyers' bar, and the sitting justices. So basically, the Minister of Justice in the government chooses candidates to bring up to the committee, and the committee, I think it has 10 members. The government representative, the opposition representatives, the justices, and the lawyers. Committee sits and votes whether to approve or disapprove the justice minister's nominees. So that's how we get our Supreme Court justices approved.
If Bibi is convicted before his law passes, what happens next?
$1 million question. First of all, his trial, while it has already began, it's been going quite slowly. And I think either way, it would take another year or two before we know, if he retains his innocence or is proven guilty. But if he is convicted in the Jerusalem District Court, he can appeal to the Supreme Court. And then there is going to be a legal question. Can he remain in office after being convicted or not? The law right now says that he can remain in office until the Supreme Court has made a decision. But there will certainly be an appeal to the Supreme Court asking the court to intervene and remove him because he has been convicted of a crime. What will the Supreme Court do in that situation? God knows. And of course, he could lose his majority potentially. But then the issue with Netanyahu is not only him losing a majority. That already happened in 2 previous election cycles. The question is, can a different majority be formed to replace him?
Okay. Can you tell us why Natan Sharansky, who escaped religious persecution in Russia, voted against the religious rights of non-Orthodox Jews in Israel?
I'm not aware enough of Mr. Sharansky's voting record when he was a member of the Knesset, so I can't talk about that. I can tell you that when Sharansky, who was a hero to many American Jews and Israeli Jews for his activism for the rights of Jews in the Soviet Union, his last role in public life was the head of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is a non-governmental but semi-governmental organization that works in Israel and in Jewish communities around the world and is responsible for the connections between Israel and the Jewish diaspora. In that role, Natan Sharansky came up with something that we in Israel call the Western Wall Compromise. There is an ongoing dispute over the ability of Jews who are not from the Orthodox stream to pray according to their ways and traditions in the Western Wall, which is one of the most, important Jewish sites in Israel and most, for Jews all over the world. And because the majority of the Jewish community in the United States is not Orthodox, belongs to the Reform and Conservative Jewish streams, there was an attempt to bring a compromise to this issue, and Sharansky led it. It was voted by the government. Netanyahu was prime minister. This happened in 2016. And the compromise was approved, and it was supposed to give more prayer rights to the non-Orthodox streams. But then the ultra-Orthodox made a riot and threatened to disband their alliance with Netanyahu. He immediately caved and basically put that compromise plan, which Sharansky worked on for many long months, basically put it in the freezer deep inside, and it has never been actually implemented. I thought that when this happened that Sharansky would resign because this was an issue of his honor and his word. He gave his word to the leaders of the American Jewish community that this is the plan he's going to promote and that it will be approved and implemented. He didn't resign, and I personally thought that even though I see him personally as a hero and as someone that I really admire for his activism and for what he did in the Soviet Union, I thought I was honestly disappointed by that. I thought he could have made a moral stand about this issue. And ever since he left the Jewish Agency, it's still been stuck and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Maybe the Supreme Court will intervene at some point.
What has been the public's reaction to these cycles of elections? Do you anticipate any social unrest should this election fail as well? Or has there been social unrest or protests on the ground in Israel since these cycles began?
There were very widespread protests a few months ago after Benny Gantz entered Netanyahu's government, because this led many supporters of Benny Gantz and the other parties that oppose Netanyahu to feel betrayed, because Gantz is the leader of the Blue and White Party that received 35 seats in the previous election cycles. He promised he would not go into a government with Netanyahu. He did hint at some point that he might form a government with Netanyahu, but he said it would be a secular unity government, meaning Blue and White and Likud without the ultra-Orthodox. Eventually, he just crawled into a government with Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox still in power. And this led to a sense of betrayal, and together with restrictions that the government placed during the COVID time that were not enforced on the ultra-Orthodox population. Again, because of the ultra-Orthodox party's political power, there was a very clear discrimination in the enforcement of the COVID regulations between the ultra-Orthodox and other populations. All of that led to very widespread protests. At some point, they attracted tens of thousands of people. But during the election, these protests have actually died down. You can say maybe it's because of weather. Now, it was the winter. The protests were mostly in the summer. And you can say that maybe the momentum just died, or you can say that people are more focused on the election itself. And so, we're all going to vote on Tuesday. So protesting, it's one tool in the democracy, but when you have an election, maybe it makes more sense to, first of all, go and vote. And second of all, try to convince other people to go and vote and try to convince people to change how they vote. So that's been the focus. I think the bigger threat than social unrest, and as long as there's no violence, is actually apathy. It's people giving up, people saying, another election, it doesn't matter anymore, nothing can change, nothing can happen. I think that's the most dangerous phenomenon, that people will just get tired of the democratic process.
What are types of issues that are most important to Israeli voters?
Great question. To each voter, their own priorities, obviously. To some voters, the most important issues have to do with, like I said, the religious stuff. For others, most important are identity politics. The identity politics are very strong in Israel. People vote based on their family history and their level of religiosity, their personal background. Of course, security is a consideration. But I want to give you an example about security, which I think you will find interesting. Like Shai mentioned, I live in a kibbutz. A kibbutz is used to be a socialist kind of community. Today, it's just a community that have a more kind of communal element to it. I live in a kibbutz on the Israeli border with Gaza. When I say on the Israeli border with Gaza, what I mean is Gaza is less than a mile from my house, where I'm speaking to you right now. My kibbutz, Nachal Oz, you can read about it in Wikipedia and in articles that have been published over the years, officially the most bombarded place in the state of Israel over the years. Mortars, rockets, etc. In my kibbutz, in every election in the last 2 decades, during which the population here has suffered from the mortars and the rockets and Hamas digging tunnels in order to attack us and other wonderful stuff, 80 to 85% of the residents vote for center-left parties. Labor, Meretz, Yesh Atid, 80 to 85% in this community that is right on the border, that is constantly under threat, vote for the center-left. 10 minutes driving from us, there is a town called Sderot. Sderot is a town larger than the kibbutz, it's thousands of residents. It is also situated very close to Gaza, and it suffers from the exact same security conditions that we suffer. Rockets, mortars, tunnels, other explosive devices. In Sderot, 80 to 85% of the population vote for the right-wing religious parties. Two communities situated on the same border, suffering from the same security conditions, from the same threats. If you did a poll The majority of voters in both communities will tell you that the number one issue for them when they vote is security. And yet in one community, 80% vote for the center left, and in the neighboring community, 80% vote for the right-wing religious. How do you explain it? My view is that this represents the fact that while security is very important to everyone, our interpretation of security, how do you find it, how do you create it, is actually based on identity. And it reflects other issues that I mentioned, levels of religiosity, identification with historically political parties. There is also, although it is dying down, but it still exists, a divide in Israel between immigrants from different parts of the world, people whose families mostly immigrated from Europe, and people who mostly immigrated from the Middle East, although it's not fully representative. There's a lot of different exceptions to that characterization. But all of these different social issues are reflected in the voting patterns. And that's how you find two communities right on the same border, suffering from the same threats, voting so dramatically apart.
Thank you, Amir. This is the last question, and then I'll ask one question myself before we end. Is there a noticeable pattern among Israeli voters along lines of ethnicity? Ethnic Russians, Ethiopians, Moroccans, all traditional aligning with specific parties?
Well, there is to some degree, and it also depends on age groups. Among older people, you see very clear voting patterns around ethnic origins. That definitely exists. And again, this is a broad characterization. There are many exceptions to the rule. But you will see, for example, that Avigdor Lieberman, who leads a secular right-wing party that now opposes Netanyahu, his base of support is older Russian-speaking citizens. With younger Russian-speaking citizens, the second and third generation to the big Russian immigration to Israel in the early 1990s, that's a much more diverse voting group. They can vote for Lieberman, but also for Lapid and for Netanyahu, Meretz, and I mean, all over the place. When we talk about immigrants from Morocco and Northern Africa, the big immigration wave from there was in the 1950s and 60s. The second and third, the first and second generation of that immigration wave is very clearly voting for Likud and for Shas, which is the ultra-Orthodox, Mizrahi party. But third generation, younger people, much more diverse, not as monolithic. So what we see is that there are definitely these voting patterns, but they are not set in stone, and they can change over time, but it takes a lot of time to change them.
Thank you, Amir. So this is my last question for our session. So you spent 3 years in Washington, D.C. covering the Trump administration, in addition to American Jewish community, and now you're back in Israel as the U.S. editor, presumably covering the Biden administration.
Yes.
What differences have you noticed so far between the two administrations? And I know that the current administration is fairly new, but anything that comes to mind as either clear differences or similarities?
There are many clear differences, even though Biden has only been in office for less than 2 months. First of all, there is an election in Israel, and Biden is not publicly intervening in it. Maybe his administration is doing something behind the scenes, but in the 3 previous election rounds, Trump was basically part of the Likud campaign. He was actively working to get Netanyahu reelected, very bluntly. He did all kinds of initiatives and gestures right before the election to help Netanyahu. Biden is not doing anything to help or hurt Netanyahu. He's just staying out of our election, which I think is the good thing for any American administration to do. On issues related to the American Jewish community, one thing I noticed is that, and this is symbolic, but symbolism still matters sometimes. January 27 was the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. During Trump's first week in the White House, January 27 of 2017, his administration released a statement on International Holocaust Remembrance Day without mentioning Jews, Judaism, 6 million, or anti-Semitism. It's if the Holocaust had nothing to do with the Jews. I don't think this was done on purpose. I think it was just a matter of incompetence and a not really functional administration. But Biden put out a statement that was just clear-cut, respectful, mentioned the Jewish central aspect of the Holocaust without leaving out other victims. I mean, you can say this is symbolic, but I think more than the Jewish symbolism, it shows an administration that pretty much knows what it's doing and is more functional. And for me as a journalist, I see that as well, just in the terms of being able to communicate with this administration and to get answers and to understand what is going on. The Trump administration was really a crazy roller coaster for the entire 4 years, unstable. You would talk to a person and the next day you don't know if they were still going to work in the White House. It's just, I think Biden is creating much less noise. And maybe that's why, Trump, when he entered the White House, had, I think, already, 50, 60 million followers on Twitter, but his approval rating never went above 49%. Biden has, I think, 9 million followers on Twitter, but his approval rating has been consistently over 51%, 52, 53, ever since he started being president. And, less noise, but maybe that's more useful to a president for functioning.
Amir, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all the audience that joined us. Just a small plug-in. So if you thought the Israeli elections were complicated, the Palestinian elections coming up are even more complicated. We're going to have an event on April 15th covering the Palestinian elections, which we'll advertise through our center and with other partners. So stay tuned for that. Amir, thank you so much for your time. And I hope your family is healthy and safe in Israel.
Thank you very much. And yes, I hope everyone will stay safe. Thank you, Shai. And, we'll see what happens.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.